Part 1. Chapter 1. When the cashier had given him the change out of his 5-franc piece, George Duroy left the restaurant. As he had a good carriage, both naturally and from his military training, he drew himself up, twirled his moustache, and threw upon the lingering customers a rapid and sweeping glance, one of those glances which take in everything within their range like a casting net. The women looked up at him in turn, 3 little work-girls, a middle-aged music mistress, disheveled, untidy, and wearing a bonnet always dusty and a dress always awry, and 2 shopkeepers' wives dining with their husbands, all regular customers at this slap-bang establishment. When he was on the pavement outside, he stood still for a moment, asking himself what he should do. It was the 28th of June, and he had just 3 francs 40 centimes in his pocket to carry him to the end of the month. This meant the option of 2 dinners without lunch or 2 lunches without dinner. He reflected that as the earlier repasts cost 20 sous apiece, and the latter 30, he would, if he were content with the lunches, be 1 franc 20 centimes to the good, which would further represent 2 snacks of bread and sausage and 2 box of beer on the boulevards. This latter item was his greatest extravagance and his chief pleasure of the night, and he began to descend the Rue Notre-Dame de Lorette. He walked as in the days when he had worn a hussar uniform, his chest thrown out and his legs slightly apart, as if he had just left the saddle, pushing his way through the crowded street, and shouldering folk to avoid having to step aside. He wore his somewhat shabby hat on one side, and brought his heels smartly down on the pavement. He seemed ever ready to defy somebody or something, the passers-by, the houses, the whole city, retaining all the swagger of a dashing cavalry man in civil life. Although wearing a 60-franc suit, he was not devoid of a certain somewhat loud elegance. Tall, well-built, fair, with a curly moustache twisted up at the ends, bright blue eyes with small pupils, and reddish-brown hair curling naturally and parted in the middle, he bore a strong resemblance to the daredevil of popular romances. It was one of those summer evenings on which air seems to be lacking in Paris. The city, hot as an oven, seemed to swelter in the stifling night. The sewers breathed out their poisonous breath through their granite mouths, and the underground kitchens gave forth to the street through their windows the stench of dishwater and stale sauces. The doorkeepers in their shirtsleeves sat astride straw-bottomed chairs within the carriage entrances to the houses, smoking their pipes, and the pedestrians walked with flagging steps, head bare, and hat in hand. When George Duroy reached the boulevards, he paused again, undecided as to what he should do. He now thought of going on to the Champs-Élysées and the Avenue du Bois de Boulogne to seek a little fresh air under the trees, but another wish also assailed him, a desire for a love affair. What shape would it take? He did not know, but he had been awaiting it for 3 months, night and day. Occasionally, thanks to his good looks and gallant bearing, he gleaned a few crumbs of love here and there, but he was always hoping for something further and better. With empty pockets and hot blood, he kindled at the contact of the prowlers who murmur at street corners, "Will you come home with me, dear?" But he dared not follow them, not being able to pay them, and, besides, he was awaiting something else, less venally vulgar kisses. He liked, however, the localities in which women of the town swarm, their balls, their cafes, and their streets. He liked to rub shoulders with them, speak to them, chaff them, inhale their strong perfumes, feel himself near them. They were women at any rate, women made for love. He did not despise them with the innate contempt of a well-born man. He turned towards the Madeleine, following the flux of the crowd which flowed along, overcome by the heat. The chief cafes, filled with customers, were overflowing onto the pavement, and displayed their drinking public under the dazzling glare of their lit-up fascias. In front of them, on little tables, square or round, were glasses holding fluids of every shade, red, yellow, green, brown, and inside the decanters glittered the large transparent cylinders of ice, serving to cool the bright, clear water. Duroy had slackened his pace, a longing to drink parched his throat. A hot thirst, a summer evening's thirst assailed him, and he fancied the delightful sensation of cool drinks flowing across his palate. But if he only drank 2 boxes of beer in the evening, farewell to the slender supper of the morrow, and he was only too well acquainted with the hours of short commons at the end of the month. He said to himself, I must hold out till 10 o'clock, and then I'll have my bock at the American cafe. Confound it, how thirsty I am though. And he scanned the men seated at the tables drinking, all the people who could quench their thirst as much as they pleased. He went on, passing in front of the cafes with a sprightly swaggering air, and guessing at a glance from their dress and bearing how much money each customer ought to have about him. Wrath against these men quietly sitting there rose up within him. If their pockets were rummaged, gold, silver, and coppers would be found in them. On an average each one must have at least 2 louis. There were certainly 100 to a café, 100 times 2 louis is 4,000 francs. He murmured, the swine, as he walked gracefully past them. If he could have had hold of one of them at a nice dark corner he would have twisted his neck without scruple, as he used to do the country folks' fowls on field days. And he recalled his 2 years in Africa and the way in which he used to pillage the Arabs when stationed at little outposts in the south. A bright and cruel smile flitted across his lips at the recollection of an escapade which had cost the lives of 3 men of the Aldalana tribe, and had furnished him and his comrades with a score of fowls, a couple of sheep, some gold, and food for laughter for 6 months. The culprits had never been found, and, what is more, they had hardly been looked for, the Arab being looked upon as somewhat in the light of the natural prey of the soldier. In Paris it was another thing. One could not plunder prettily, sword by side and revolver in hand, far from civil authority. He felt in his heart all the instincts of a sub-officer let loose in a conquered country. He certainly regretted his 2 years in the desert. What a pity he had not stopped there. But, then, he had hoped something better in returning home. And now, yes, it was very nice now, was it not? He clicked his tongue as if to verify the parched state of his palate. The crowd swept past him slowly, and he kept thinking. Set of hogs, all these idiots have money in their waistcoat pockets. He pushed against people and softly whistled a lively tune. Gentlemen whom he thus elbowed turned grumbling, and women murmured, "What a brute!" He passed the vaudeville theatre and stopped before the American Café, asking himself whether he should not take his bock, so greatly did thirst torture him. Before making up his mind, he glanced at the illuminated clock. It was 9:15. He knew himself that as soon as the glassful of beer was before him he would gulp it down. What would he do then up to 11 o'clock? He passed on. "I will go as far as the Madeleine," he said, and walked back slowly. As he reached the corner of the Place de l'Opéra, he passed a stout young fellow, whose face he vaguely recollected having seen somewhere. He began to follow him, turning over his recollections and repeating to himself half aloud. "Where the deuce did I know that joker?" He searched without being able to recollect, and then all at once, by a strange phenomenon of memory, the same man appeared to him thinner, younger, and clad in a hussar uniform. He exclaimed aloud, "What, Forestier?" and stepping out he tapped the other on the shoulder. The promenader turned round and looked at him, and then said, "What is it, sir?" Duroy broke into a laugh. "Don't you know me?" said he. "No." "George Duroy, of the 6th Hussars." Forestier held out his hands, exclaiming, "What, old fellow? How are you?" "Very well, and you?" "Oh, not very brilliant." "Just fancy, I have a chest in brown paper now." I cough 6 months out of 12, through a cold I caught at Bougival the year of my return to Paris, 4 years ago. But you look well. And Forestier, taking his old comrade's arm, spoke to him of his illness, related the consultations, opinions, and advice of the doctors, and the difficulty of following this advice in his position. He was told to spend the winter in the south, but how could he? He was married, and a journalist in a good position. I am political editor of the Vie Française. I write the proceedings in the Senate for the Salut, and from time to time literary criticisms for the Planète. That is so. I have made my way. Duroy looked at him with surprise. He was greatly changed, matured. He had now the manner, bearing, and dress of a man in a good position and sure of himself, and the stomach of a man who dines well. Formerly he had been thin, slight, supple, heedless, brawling, noisy, and always ready for a spree. In 3 years Paris had turned him into someone quite different, stout and serious, and with some white hairs about his temples, though he was not more than 27. Forestier asked, "Where are you going?" Duroy answered, "Nowhere, I am just taking a stroll before turning in." "Well, will you come with me to the Vie Française, where I have some proofs to correct, and then we will take a bock together?" "All right." They began to walk on, arm in arm, with that easy familiarity existing between schoolfellows and men in the same regiment. "What are you doing in Paris?" asked Forestier. Duroy shrugged his shoulders. "Simply starving. As soon as I finished my term of service I came here, to make a fortune, or rather for the sake of living in Paris, and for 6 months I have been a clerk in the offices of the Northern Railway at 1,500 francs a year, nothing more." Forestier murmured, "Hang it, that's not much." "I should think not. But how can I get out of it?" "I am alone, I don't know anyone, I can get no one to recommend me." It is not goodwill that is lacking, but means. His comrade scanned him from head to foot, like a practical man examining a subject, and then said, in a tone of conviction, "You see, my boy, everything depends upon assurance here. A clever fellow can more easily become a minister than an undersecretary. One must obtrude one's self on people, not ask things of them. But how the deuce is it that you could not get hold of anything better than a clerk's berth on the Northern Railway?" Duroy replied, "I looked about everywhere, but could not find anything." "But I have something in view just now. I have been offered a riding master's place at Pellerin's." "There I shall get 3,000 francs at the lowest." Forestier stopped short. "Don't do that, it is stupid, when you ought to be earning 10,000 francs. You would nip your future in the bud. In your office, at any rate, you are hidden, no one knows you, you can emerge from it if you are strong enough to make your way. But once a riding master, and it is all over. It is as if you were head waiter at a place where all Paris goes to dine. When once you have given riding lessons to people in society or to their children, they will never be able to look upon you as an equal. He remained silent for a few moments, evidently reflecting, and then asked, "Have you a bachelor's degree?" "No, I failed to pass twice." "That is no matter, as long as you studied for it." If anyone mentions Cicero or Tiberius, you know pretty well what they are talking about. Yes, pretty well. Good, no one knows any more, with the exception of a score of idiots who have taken the trouble. It is not difficult to pass for being well informed, the great thing is not to be caught in some blunder. You can maneuver, avoid the difficulty, turn the obstacle, and floor others by means of a dictionary. Men are all as stupid as geese and ignorant as donkeys. He spoke like a self-possessed blade who knows what life is, and smiled as he watched the crowd go by. But all at once he began to cough, and stopped again until the fit was over, adding, in a tone of discouragement, "Isn't it aggravating not to be able to get rid of this cough? And we are in the middle of summer." "Oh, this winter I shall go and get cured at Mentone." Health before everything. They halted on the boulevard Poissonnière before a large glass door, on the inner side of which an open newspaper was pasted. Three passers-by had stopped and were reading it. Above the door, stretched in large letters of flame, outlined by gas jets, the inscription La Vie Française. The pedestrians passing into the light shed by these three dazzling words suddenly appeared as visible as in broad daylight, then disappeared again into darkness. Forestier pushed the door open, saying, "Come in." Duroy entered, ascended an ornate yet dirty staircase, visible from the street, passed through an ante-room where two messengers bowed to his companion, and reached a kind of waiting room, shabby and dusty, upholstered in dirty green Utrecht velvet, covered with spots and stains, and worn in places as if mice had been gnawing it. "Sit down," said Forestier. "I will be back in 5 minutes." And he disappeared through one of the three doors opening into the room. A strange, special, indescribable odor, the odor of a newspaper office, floated in the air of the room. Duroy remained motionless, slightly intimidated, above all surprised. From time to time folk passed hurriedly before him, coming in at one door and going out at another before he had time to look at them. They were now young lads, with an appearance of haste, holding in their hand a sheet of paper which fluttered from the hurry of their progress, now compositors, whose white blouses, spotted with ink, revealed a clean shirt collar and cloth trousers like those of men of fashion, and who carefully carried strips of printed paper, fresh proofs damp from the press. Sometimes a gentleman entered rather too elegantly attired, his waist too tightly pinched by his frock coat, his leg too well set off by the cut of his trousers, his foot squeezed into a shoe too pointed at the toe, some fashionable reporter bringing in the echoes of the evening. Others, too, arrived, serious, important-looking men, wearing tall hats with flat brims, as if this shape distinguished them from the rest of mankind. Forestier reappeared holding the arm of a tall, thin fellow, between 30 and 40 years of age, in evening dress, very dark, with his moustache ends stiffened in sharp points, and an insolent and self-satisfied bearing. Forestier said to him, "Good night, dear master." The other shook hands with him, saying, "Good night, my dear fellow," and went downstairs whistling, with his cane under his arm. Duroy asked, "Who is that?" Jacques Rival, you know, the celebrated descriptive writer, the duelist. He has just been correcting his proofs. Garin, Montel, and he are the three best descriptive writers, for facts and points, we have in Paris. He gets 30,000 francs a year here for 2 articles a week. As they were leaving they met a short, stout man, with long hair and untidy appearance, who was puffing as he came up the stairs. Forestier bowed low to him. "Norbert de Varenne," said he, "the poet, the author of Les Soleils Morts, another who gets long prices." "Every tale he writes for us costs 300 francs, and the longest do not run to 200 lines." "But let us turn into the Neapolitan café, I am beginning to choke with thirst." As soon as they were seated at a table in the café, Forestier called for 2 bocks, and drank off his own at a single draught, while Duroy sipped his beer in slow mouthfuls, tasting it and relishing it like something rare and precious. His companion was silent, and seemed to be reflecting. Suddenly he exclaimed, "Why don't you try journalism?" The other looked at him in surprise, and then said, "But, you know, I have never written anything." "Bah, everyone must begin." "I could give you a job to hunt up information for me, to make calls and inquiries." "You would have to start with 250 francs a month and or cab hire." "Shall I speak to the manager about it?" Certainly. Very well, then, come and dine with me tomorrow. I shall only have 5 or 6 people, the governor, Monsieur Walter and his wife, Jacques Rival, and Norbert de Varenne, whom you have just seen, and a lady, a friend of my wife. Is it settled? Duroy hesitated, blushing and perplexed. At length he murmured, "You see, I have no clothes." Forestier was astounded. "You have no dress clothes?" "Hang it all, they are indispensable, though. In Paris one would be better off without a bed than without a dress suit." Then, suddenly feeling in his waistcoat pocket, he drew out some gold, took 2 louis, placed them in front of his old comrade, and said in a cordial and familiar tone, "You will pay me back when you can." Hire or arrange to pay by installments for the clothes you want, whichever you like, but come and dine with me tomorrow, 7:30, number 17 Rue Fontaine. Duroy, confused, picked up the money, stammering, "You are too good, I am very much obliged to you, you may be sure I shall not forget." The other interrupted him. "All right. Another bock, eh?" "Waiter, 2 bocks." Then, when they had drunk them, the journalist said, "Will you stroll about a bit for an hour?" "Certainly." And they set out again in the direction of the Madeleine. "What shall we do?" said Forestier. They say that in Paris the lounger can always find something to amuse him, but it is not true. When I want to lounge about of an evening, never know where to go. A drive round the Bois de Boulogne is only amusing with a woman, and one has not always one to hand. The café concerts may please my chemist and his wife, but not me. Then what is there to do? Nothing. There ought to be a summer garden like the Parc Monceau, open at night, where one would hear very good music while sipping cool drinks under the trees. It should not be a pleasure resort, but a lounging place, with a high price for entrance in order to attract the fine ladies. One ought to be able to stroll along well-gravelled walks lit up by electric light, and to sit down when one wished to hear the music near or at a distance. We had about the sort of thing formerly at Musard's, but with a smack of the low-class dancing room, and too much dance music, not enough space, not enough shade, not enough gloom. It would want a very fine garden and a very extensive one. It would be delightful. Where shall we go? Duroy, rather perplexed, did not know what to say. At length he made up his mind. I have never been in the Folies Bergère. I should not mind taking a look round there, he said. The Folies Bergère, exclaimed his companion, the deuce, we shall roast there as in an oven. But, very well, then, it is always funny there. And they turned on their heels to make their way to the Rue du Faubourg Montmartre. The lit-up front of the establishment threw a bright light into the 4 streets which met in front of it. A string of cabs were waiting for the close of the performance. Forestier was walking in when Duroy checked him. "You are passing the pay box," said he. "I never pay," was the reply, in a tone of importance. When he approached the check-takers they bowed, and one of them held out his hand. The journalist asked, "Have you a good box?" "Certainly, Monsieur Forestier." He took the ticket held out to him, pushed the padded door with its leather borders, and they found themselves in the auditorium. Tobacco smoke slightly veiled like a faint mist the stage and the further side of the theatre. Rising incessantly in thin white spirals from the cigars and pipes, this light fog ascended to the ceiling, and there, accumulating, formed under the dome above the crowded gallery a cloudy sky. In the broad corridor leading to the circular promenade, a group of women were awaiting newcomers in front of one of the bars, at which sat enthroned 3 painted and faded vendors of love and liquor. The tall mirrors behind them reflected their backs and the faces of passers-by. Forestier pushed his way through the groups, advancing quickly with the air of a man entitled to consideration. He went up to a box keeper. "Box 17, said he. "This way, sir." And they were shut up in a little open box draped with red, and holding 4 chairs of the same color, so near to one another that one could scarcely slip between them. The 2 friends sat down. To the right, as to the left, following a long curved line, the 2 ends of which joined the proscenium, a row of similar cribs held people seated in like fashion, with only their heads and chests visible. On the stage, 3 young fellows in fleshings, one tall, one of middle size, and one small, were executing feats in turn upon a trapeze. The tall one first advanced with short, quick steps, smiling and waving his hand as though wafting a kiss. The muscles of his arms and legs stood out under his tights. He expanded his chest to take off the effect of his too prominent stomach, and his face resembled that of a barber's block, for a careful parting divided his locks equally on the center of the skull. He gained the trapeze by a graceful bound, and, hanging by the hands, whirled round it like a wheel at full speed, or, with stiff arms and straightened body, held himself out horizontally in space. Then he jumped down, saluted the audience again with a smile amidst the applause of the stalls, and went and leaned against the scenery, showing off the muscles of his legs at every step. The second, shorter and more squarely built, advanced in turn, and went through the same performance, which the third also recommenced amidst most marked expressions of approval from the public. But Duroy scarcely noticed the performance, and, with head averted, kept his eyes on the promenade behind him, full of men and prostitutes. Said Forestier to him, "Look at the stalls, nothing but middle-class folk with their wives and children, good noodlepates who come to see the show." In the boxes, men about town, some artistes, some girls, good second-raters, and behind us, the strangest mixture in Paris. Who are these men? Watch them. There is something of everything, of every profession, and every caste, but blackguardism predominates. There are clerks of all kinds, bankers' clerks, government clerks, shopmen, reporters, poncers, officers in plain clothes, swells in evening dress, who have dined out, and have dropped in here on their way from the opera to the Théâtre des Italiens, and then again, too, quite a crowd of suspicious folk who defy analysis. As to the women, only one type, the girl who sups at the American cafe, the girl at 1 or 2 louis who looks out for foreigners at 5 louis, and lets her regular customers know when she is disengaged. We have known them for the last 10 years, we see them every evening all the year round in the same places, except when they are making a hygienic sojourn at Saint Lazare or at Lauchini. Duroy no longer heard him. One of these women was leaning against the box and looking at him. She was a stout brunette, her skin whitened with paint, her black eyes lengthened at the corners with pencil and shaded by enormous and artificial eyebrows. Her 2 exuberant bosoms stretched the dark silk of her dress almost to bursting, and her painted lips, red as a fresh wound, gave her an aspect bestial, ardent, unnatural, but which, nevertheless, aroused desire. She beckoned with her head one of the friends who was passing, a blonde with red hair, and stout, like herself, and said to her, in a voice loud enough to be heard, "There is a pretty fellow, if he would like to have me for 10 louis the first should not say no." Forestier turned and tapped Duroy on the knee, with a smile. "That is meant for you, you are a success, my dear fellow." "I congratulate you." The ex-sub-officer blushed, and mechanically fingered the 2 pieces of gold in his waistcoat pocket. The curtain had dropped, and the orchestra was now playing a waltz. Duroy said, "Suppose we take a turn round the promenade." "Just as you like." They left their box, and were at once swept away by the throng of promenaders. Pushed, pressed, squeezed, shaken, they went on, having before their eyes a crowd of hats. The girls, in pairs, passed amidst this crowd of men, traversing it with facility, gliding between elbows, chests, and backs as if quite at home, perfectly at their ease, like fish in water, amidst this masculine flood. Duroy, charmed, let himself be swept along, drinking in with intoxication the air vitiated by tobacco, the odor of humanity, and the perfumes of the hussies. But Forestier sweated, puffed, and coughed. "Let us go into the garden," said he. And turning to the left, they entered a kind of covered garden, cooled by two large and ugly fountains. Men and women were drinking at zinc tables placed beneath evergreen trees growing in boxes. "Another bock, eh?" said Forestier. "Willingly." They sat down and watched the passing throng. From time to time a woman would stop and ask, with stereotyped smile, "Are you going to stand me anything?" And as Forestier answered, a glass of water from the fountain, she would turn away, muttering, "Go on, you duffer." But the stout brunette, who had been leaning, just before, against the box occupied by the two comrades, reappeared, walking proudly arm in arm with the stout blonde. They were really a fine pair of women, well matched. She smiled on perceiving Duroy, as though their eyes had already told secrets, and, taking a chair, sat down quietly in face of him, and making her friend sit down, too, gave the order in a clear voice. "Waiter, 2 grenadines." Forestier, rather surprised, said, "You make yourself at home." She replied, "It is your friend that captivates me." "He is really a pretty fellow." "I believe that I could make a fool of myself for his sake." Duroy, intimidated, could find nothing to say. He twisted his curly moustache, smiling in a silly fashion. The waiter brought the drinks, which the women drank off at a draught, then they rose, and the brunette, with a friendly nod of the head, and a tap on the arm with her fan, said to Duroy, "Thanks, dear, you are not very talkative." And they went off swaying their trains. Forestier laughed. "I say, old fellow, you are very successful with the women." "You must look after it. It may lead to something." He was silent for a moment, and then continued in the dreamy tone of men who think aloud. "It is through them, too, that one gets on quickest." And as Duroy still smiled without replying, he asked, "Are you going to stop any longer?" "I have had enough of it. I am going home." The other murmured, "Yes, I shall stay a little longer. It is not late." Forestier rose. "Well, good night, then. Till tomorrow." "Don't forget. 17 Rue Fontaine, at 7:30. "That is settled. Till tomorrow." "Thanks." They shook hands, and the journalist walked away. As soon as he had disappeared, Duroy felt himself free, and again he joyfully felt the 2 pieces of gold in his pocket. Then rising, he began to traverse the crowd, which he followed with his eyes. He soon caught sight of the 2 women, the blonde and the brunette, who were still making their way, with their proud bearing of beggars, through the throng of men. He went straight up to them, and when he was quite close he no longer dared to do anything. The brunette said, "Have you found your tongue again?" He stammered, "By Jove," without being able to say anything else. The 3 stood together, checking the movement, the current of which swept round them. All at once she asked, "Will you come home with me?" And he, quivering with desire, answered roughly, "Yes, but I have only a louis in my pocket." She smiled indifferently. "It is all the same to me," and took his arm in token of possession. As they went out he thought that with the other louis he could easily hire a suit of dress clothes for the next evening.